So I'm going to start by introducing what is game theory, and you'll see that actually game theory is quite easy. It's quite easy to understand what it actually does, and it's a very powerful way of analyzing different situations. So let's start with why it's called game theory, right? Now, game is a situation in which players, participants, make strategic decisions. So it doesn't have to be actually a game, right? Doesn't have to be actually a game. It basically can be, game theory can be used to study any situation where there is strategic behavior. The goal of using game theory is to determine the optimal strategy for each player. Given the situation you are facing, what's the best strategy you can use? And we're going to frame different scenarios in the terminology of a chess game, kind of. So think about a chess game. What do you have in a chess game? Let's say you and I are playing a chess game. So there must be you and I. We are the players, right? Someone has to play in the game. Players. You play a game for a reason. In chess game, you win by, like basically trapping the king, right? So and you have limitations of what you can do, actions, right? For example, the knight can only move sideways. The pawn can only move forward until you cross the board, right? Actions are what you can do and what you can do. There are limitations on that. Payoff, what you want, how you win. Now, in a chess game, you win by trapping the king, but you can imagine in many other scenarios that you can use game theory for. It could be money, right? It could be money. Finally, strategies. Given your opponent, given your the actions you can take and the actions that your opponent can take, given the payoff you get in different outcomes, what strategy do you want to use? So that's the 4 components of a game. You can frame the public good exercise we did last week or the week before in the game theoretic framework. For the players we had back then were David, John, and Paul. The actions they could have taken include participating in funding the public good and not participating in funding the public good. That's the 2 options they can choose from. The payoff is the net benefit from having or not having the public good. And we discussed the strategy as, well, actually, you might not want to participate if the good can be funded by the 2 other players alone. So you can frame pretty much any scenario in the terminology of game theory. And in the game theory, once again, the objective is to find the optimal strategy. What is an optimal strategy? Optimal strategy in game theory is a strategy that you want to stick with. That's what you want to do, given the situation at hand, right? You have no incentive to deviate from the strategy. That's optimal. So in the public good example, we have gone through the logic, right? If the public good is expensive, everyone's participation is necessary. So there is no incentive to quit. But when the public good is cheap, people want to quit because they don't have to pay and the public good might still be provided. Using the idea that optimal strategy is a strategy that you want to stick with, we have this equilibrium concept in game theory. A pure strategy Nash equilibrium in game theory is the case where each player chooses a single action. Given what action the other player have chosen, each player has no incentive to change your action. So what does that mean? That means, given what I do, you don't want to change what you're doing. Given what you do, I don't want to change what I'm doing. So you do what you do, I do what I do, neither of us want to change. That's a Nash equilibrium, right? You do what you do, I do what I do. Nash equilibrium, if you look at it, it's about stability. You do what you do, and you do not want to change. I do what I do, and I don't want to change. So it's about stability. As you will see in a moment, in the first example, Nash equilibrium does not necessarily maximize social welfare. Stable is not the same as efficient. Stable is not the same as efficient. There's times when you do what you do, I do what I do, we are actually both worse off, right? So a game can be there are two ways of representing a game you will see in this course. The first one is called a normal form game, where you put the players. Well, in this course you only see two players because representing a game with more players is more complicated. So you have two players, player 1 and player 2. The player 1 will be on the right hand side, on the left hand side, player 2 on the top. The actions. Player 1 can choose action 1 and 2. You can see I put player 1's action beside him. Player 2 can choose action C and D. I put his action below him. Each cell represents one possible outcome. For example, the top left cell represents what happens if player 1 chooses action 1 and player 2 chooses action C. The numbers inside each cell represents the payoff in that particular outcome. For example, if player 1 takes action 1, player 2 takes action C, player 1 gets 10, player 2 gets 10. The number in the front is the payoff of the player on the left. The number after the comma is the payoff of the player at the top. So once again, let's say if player 1 takes action 1, player 2 takes action D, then you'll be in the top right corner. Player 1 will have $16, a payoff of 16, doesn't have to be money. Player 1 will have a payoff of 16, player 2 will have a payoff of 9, right? So that's the idea. And now, how do you find the Nash equilibrium? In other words, how do you find the combination of actions that would lead to a stable outcome? No one wants to change. The way to do it is by drawing circles. And I'll walk you through the logic. Let's start with what player 1 would want to do. And to ask that question, we start with assuming that player 2 has already chosen action C. We don't know that's going to be the case. We don't actually know that's the case. We just assume that's to be the case and ask what player 1 wants to do. If player 2 has chosen action C, player 1 is choosing between action 1, which gives him 10, versus action 2, which gives him 9. Right? That's okay. 10 is bigger than 9, right? 10 is bigger than 9, so you can imagine player 1 is going to choose action 1. We're going to put a circle or a box around that number, right? 10 is bigger than 9. Now we move on to action D. Suppose player 2 has chosen action D. What would player 1 choose? Player 1 is now choosing between 16 and 12. 16 is higher than 12, so he's going to pick 16. So that's action 1, and we circle that. We have to go through every single possible action of player 2, and once we've done that, we move on to asking what player 2 would do, given what player 1 is doing. So that's what we're going to do. Now, suppose player 1 has chosen action 1. What would player 2 want to do? Does player 2 want to choose action C, or does player 2 want to choose action D? So action C gives her 10, action D gives her 9, 10 is bigger than 9, so she's going to choose action C. We're going to put a circle around that. Finally, suppose player 1 has already chosen action 2. What would player 2 want to do? She can choose between action C, that pays her 9, or action D, that pays her 12. 12 is higher than 9, so she's going to choose 12. Let's circle that. The pure strategy Nash equilibrium is the cell. It's the cell with circles around all its numbers. And there is only one in this case. This situation is the pure strategy Nash equilibrium. The corresponding action is player 1 taking action 1 and player 2 taking action C. And that's the only pure strategy Nash equilibrium in this case, because no other cell have circles around all its numbers. In some other cases, you would realize that there might be more than one equilibrium. There might be more than one equilibrium. It's possible. As long as a cell has circles around all its numbers, that's a pure strategy Nash equilibrium. And let's make sure that people actually have no incentive deviating from that situation. So we are here. Player 1 currently taking action 1, player 2 currently taking action C. Is there any incentive for player 1 to switch to action 2? If he does that, he's going from getting $10 to $9, or getting a payoff of 10 to getting a payoff of 9. So there's no incentive because he's only reducing his own payoff by doing so. So he's not going to change. What about player 2? Is player 2 going to switch from action C to action D? Well, if he does that, then he's reducing his payoff from 10 to 9. So he's not going to do that. So this is actually stable. I take action 1, you take action C, no one wants to change. Stable. But is it efficient? It's not efficient. If you look at the bottom right corner, the efficient outcome is the bottom right corner, where you get $12, I get $12, we are both richer. But the bottom right corner, unfortunately, is not stable. Let's see what happens if we are here. Let's see what we are here. If we are here, player 1 player 1 looks at his payoff and realizes that, wait, currently I'm getting 12. If I switch to action 1, I'm going to get 16. That's better for me. So I'm going to switch. So he's going to switch. And now once he switches, player 2 looks at his payoff and say, wait, if I'm choosing action D, I'm getting 9. But if I switch to action C, I get 10. So we're back to the stable outcome again. An efficient outcome might not be stable. And we see that all the time in Hong Kong, right? Think about it. Think about what happens in Hong Kong. We all agree, probably every parent agrees, that it would be better for children to study less. right? For kids to study less, right? No parent, probably most parents would not agree for schools to don't want schools to give too much homework, and certainly would prefer kindergarten to be more about playing than studying. But is that if let's say we actually live in a world where kids don't need to study in kindergarten. Now, is that stable? So if all the kids just play in the kindergarten, no one studies, and my kid actually study, what would happen? My kid would get into better primary school than all the other kids, right? So it's in my interest to have my kid studying. So then every parent would realize that, and then you're back to the stable outcome where everyone study and no play. So efficient outcome, but the thing is, if everyone study, that's the same as everyone not studying. It doesn't change the relative ability of the kids. So you see that all the time. Efficient outcome is often not stable. In some sense, it's kind of a pessimistic view, because very often what you get is kind of a race towards the bottom. Whoever willing to do the worst wins. And there are some situations that would make that true. So this is one of them. Efficient outcome is not stable. Now, in this example, we can actually observe a few more things here besides Nash equilibrium. One of them is you can see that sometimes a player always stick with a single action. As in this case, player 1 always use action 1. He never uses action 2. And this is called a dominant strategy. Using action 1 is called a dominant strategy or dominating strategy. And you do that because it's always better, right? 10 is strictly better than 9, and 16 is strictly better than 12. So it's always better, never use something else. Doesn't matter what you do. It's always better for me to just take action 1. So this is a strategy that is optimal no matter what an opponent does. Action 2 is called a dominated strategy because it's never optimal to use. Notice that because this game is pretty simple, so this game is pretty simple. So you have a dominant strategy, a dominated strategy. Sometimes it's actually possible to have dominated strategy but without dominant strategy. When you have more than 2 options. Let's say you have 3 options, right? You have 3 options. Maybe action 1 is better in some occasions. Action 2 is better in some other occasions, but action 3 is never good. Then action 3 is never used and is dominated. But neither action 1 nor action 2 are dominant strategies because you use both of them, right? So in this particular case, it's simple enough that you have one dominant strategy and one dominated strategy. In our current example, action 1 is strictly dominant strategy. And action 2 is strictly dominated. If I slightly modify the numbers such that it's not one of the action is not strictly better, then this is called weakly. Then action 1 is weakly dominant, and action 2 is weakly dominated, right? So you can see that I modified action 10's payoff such that it's identical across the 2 actions. In this case is weakly dominant and weakly dominated. If you can identify dominated strategies, then you have another way of approaching the equilibrium. Now, a dominated strategy is never the best response. So it's never used. It's always better to do something else. So you can say that you don't really need that action in the game. It doesn't do anything. No one ever uses it. So we might as well eliminate it from our consideration. In our particular example, 10 is better than 9, 16 is better than 12. Player 1 is never going to use action 2 regardless of what player 2 does. So in some sense, it doesn't need to exist. It doesn't need to exist. You can eliminate it. But once you eliminate one action from the game has to change. Now look at what player 2 is facing right now. Player 2 is facing a situation where he either gets 10 by using action C, or he gets 9 by using action D. Is there any reason for him to use action D then? No. There's nothing that encourages him to use action D. Action D became dominated after you eliminate action 2. And notice that we are left with the Nash equilibrium. The only remaining possibility is the Nash equilibrium. So this is another way you can arrive at the Nash equilibrium. Although not every game would have dominated strategies. So this method doesn't always work, whereas drawing the one we just did always works. But this method is helpful in reducing the size of complicated games. This process is called the iterated elimination of dominated strategies, because when you eliminate one dominated strategy, you might create another dominated strategy for the other player. And this process might go on for quite a while. So this is important when you have very big games, which you don't see in this course, really. In this course, we only ask you games this size. It's not going to be more difficult than that. Right? So you get the idea. All right. So I want you to try it once before we go on to other parts. So try this one. Try drawing the circles. See if you can figure out what the Nash equilibrium is in this game. Well, you would certainly see it in an exam. So this is this is something that you definitely need to do. Okay, so try drawing circles. If you need to refer back, you can refer back. But remember, the way it works is you first start with assuming that player 2, Mary in this case, is going to take the first action available to her, followed by what would she do? What would David do when Mary chooses the second action, and so on. So try drawing the circles and see if you can figure out what's the stable outcomes here. Yeah. Yeah. If you allow, this is actually a good question. So what we have right now, what we talk about in this course is called knowing cooperative game. So the players cannot do anything outside of the options available to them. So they kind of like, yeah, I pay you something, and then let's choose something that's actually more efficient. Yeah, they're not allowed to do that in these games. In some sense, we are assuming that all available options are already expressed in the table, right? So any opportunity to cooperate is already in there, in fact, right? So in some situations, you can imagine that it's like, as I said, it might be the best for parents to cooperate, right? To cooperate and not forcing their kids to study too young, right? But it's very hard for that type of cooperation to happen. Why? Like, or it might be best. It might be best if think about like in reality, right? Probably everyone agrees that it's better not to have civil wars. That doesn't stop civil wars from happening. Why can't one side just pay off the other side? Well, many cases it's just impractical for the two sides to cooperate. So they end up fighting each other to death. So in non-cooperative games, we assume that all available options are already on the table. So they can't cooperate outside of the game. Yeah, but if they can, then yes, they should have chosen the efficient outcome. This is something that might happen. If you think about, let's say if I'm an economist and like say I ask people to play a game like that, is there anything that prevents you from negotiating with the other player to do something else? Yeah, I think we try to prevent that. Like for example, when we ask people to play games like that, we try to separate people, prevent them from talking to each other, because otherwise, very often you have people, yeah, cooperating. So it's an assumption that we don't allow that. All right, so let's see. How do you do that? Right, let's start with, as I said, let's start with player one. David. So this is like, it's called the Battle of the Sexes. It's one of the classic example used in teaching game theory. Because it's kind of like you have David and Mary. They are dating and they want to go to watch a movie together. David and Mary. David likes action movie. Mary likes romance movie. But the point is they have to go together. So what will happen? Do they go to action movie together or the romance movie together, or do they just each go to their own movie? So let's start by assuming Mary has already chosen to go to the action movie. What would David do? He can either go to the action movie with Mary or go to the romance movie alone. Now going to the action movie makes him happier, so he's going to go to the action movie. Second, suppose Mary has chosen to go to the romance movie. Now David has to choose between going to the action movie alone or go to the romance movie alone. Go to the romance movie with Mary. Going to the romance movie makes him better in this case, even though he doesn't really like romance movie. But given the choice he is going to go to the romance movie instead of going to the action movie alone. Switching to David, assuming David is choosing the action movie, what would Mary do? Mary doesn't really like the action movie, but she wants to go with David, so she is going to go to the action movie with David. Finally, if David is so nice to pick the romance movie, what would Mary do? Mary likes the romance movie, so she is going to go to the romance movie. And in the end, you have two pure strategy Nash equilibria. You have two. When you write down the solution, you write down the actions the player would take. So in this case, the actions the player would take would be either action, or it could be romance. So these are the two Nash equilibria. Is there any dominant strategy? Is there an action that player never use? No, right? If David goes to the romance movie, Mary goes to the romance movie. If David goes to the action movie, and Mary goes to the action movie, romance movie. So it's like, and vice versa. So they take, whether a player takes an action depends on whether the other player takes the same action. So there is no dominant strategy, nor is there any dominated strategy. No. So no one. Right, so that's the answer. All right, that's the answer. All right, so we could take a break now. Just so we're gonna start again at 10 past 4. When we come back, we're gonna switch to we're gonna go from a game where two players make decision simultaneously to the case when Mary gets to choose first, ladies first. What happens when Mary gets to choose first? Right, so that's when we come back. All right, so okay, once again, right now, what we have right now, this is called normal form game. In normal form game, the players don't know what the other opponent is really choosing. So that's why we have to go. That's why we are going to go through. We have gone through this logic where, okay, given what you do, what I want to do. Given what I do, what you want to do. We're looking for a situation where they don't want to change their mind. In this case in particular, we can't say anything about which outcome is more likely. As far as we know, they're equally likely, because without actually knowing what one of them is choosing, then the two outcomes are equally likely. So there's a good point in asking while these two outcomes are stable. That is, if David knows Mary is choosing action, he's going to choose action. If David knows Mary is going to choose romance, he's going to choose romance. These two are stable. If you actually ask two people to make a choice without knowing what the other player is doing, it's unlikely, it looks like, that it will end up with just these two outcomes, right? If I have to make a choice without knowing what choice you're going to make, and you have to make a choice without knowing what I have to make, then it's kind of going to be random. And sometimes, so you might choose action and I choose romance, or I choose action, you choose romance, or I choose action, you choose action, and so on. So this is something that we also have to study later on, maybe towards the end of the class. What happens in that case? But if David does know Mary is choosing action, then he wants to choose action. And if David does know Mary is choosing romance, David is choosing romance. What if Mary gets to move first? If Mary gets to move first, and we know there are two stable outcomes. They both go to the action movies and they both go to the romance movies. They both go to action movies and they go for the romance movies. If Mary gets to choose first, is she going to just choose one by random? Probably not. She probably wants to choose the one that is better for her, which is the romance movie. She likes romance movie. She knows that David is going to follow her. So why shouldn't she choose the one she likes? She should. So David is going to follow her in choosing the romance movie. And we can express this idea. We can express this idea with a tree diagram. We can express this idea with the tree diagram. Now, in this tree diagram, I have Mary. So Mary is the one moving first, followed by David, and the payoffs I just copy from above. So the number in the front represents David's payoff, and the number after the comma represents Mary's payoff. You can see that if Mary chooses the romance movie, David is choosing between going to the romance movie and getting one, or choosing the action movie and getting 0. So he's also going to choose a romance movie. But if Mary chooses the action movie, David is choosing between the action movie getting 2 and romance movie getting 0. So he's going to choose the action movie. For Mary, then, she's really just comparing between the action movie with David and the romance movie with David. She doesn't need to consider the two cases where they go separately, because that would not happen if Mary gets to choose first. So this logic can be presented with a tree diagram called and this is called an extensive form game. So you can see how the logic, how you can get, so you can get an idea of how the logic goes right now. So Mary, in the end, you would expect her to choose the romance movie. She's going to choose the romance movie because she can predict what's going to happen. Either if she chooses the romance movie, David is going to follow, she gets 2. If she chooses the action movie, David will follow, and she's going to get 1 only. So she's going to pick the romance movie. Now we're going to solve the game again more carefully and think about what's the logic involved in the way we just solved it. Now what we did just now actually involved solving the game from the back, from the very last, from the very bottom of the game. What we did is really just to think about what David would do given Mary's choice. If Mary has chosen the action movie, David would choose the action movie. If Mary has chosen the romance movie, now that's another possible. So Mary can't choose both. So we are going through different possible scenarios that cannot happen at the same time. We have to go through every single one of them. So if Mary has chosen the romance movie, David would choose the romance movie. This is a relatively simple game with just 2 possibilities, but if you have more, you have to check them. This is one of the reasons why sometimes solving these kind of games would require quite a lot of computational power, even if you ask computers to do it. Nash equilibrium, so game theory is actually also studied in computer science. The computer science department offers a course on game theory, and it's pretty much the same thing. The reason is, in a lot of scenarios that is interesting to computer scientists, you need game theory. Some examples include like artificial intelligence. For example, if you want to design a computer playing poker games, you need the computer to understand game theory, because playing poker games involve finding a stable outcome given the situation involved. So if you have many possible scenarios, then it's going to take some time to figure them all out, what to do. In our case, it's actually quite simple with just two. If Mary have chosen action, we are in the left-hand side, David chooses action. If Mary has chosen romance, then David would have chosen romance. The reason why we do that is we think that Mary is smart. Mary is so smart such that she can anticipate what David does. She's smart enough that she can anticipate what David does. For us, that means that when we want to figure out what Mary does, we first have to figure out what David does, because Mary anticipates what David does. So we start from the back. We solve what David does, right? Then we go back to try to figure out what Mary would do. Once we figure out what David would do, then we go back to ask what Mary would do, assuming that she understands what David does. This way of thinking is called backward induction. You start from the back. You start from the bottom of the game. So Mary, as we've gone through the logic already, Mary understands that she's really choosing between going to the action movie with David and romance movie with David, and she's going to choose the romance movie, right? The logic is everyone is very smart. That's the assumption here. Everyone is very smart. When I make a decision, I first try to guess what you will do in response. That means that in order to figure out what I'm going to do, I first have to figure out what you're going to do. So you have to start from the bottom. The equilibrium concept in an extensive form game is called subgame perfect equilibrium, SPE. Subgame perfect equilibrium makes, so what does it mean? Subgame refers to each individual tree node. So in our case, we have three subgames. The number one, David choosing what to do when Mary has chosen action movie. Number two, David choosing what to do when Mary has chosen romance. And number three, Mary choosing what to do. That's the first subgame. Each subgame is a game. It has all the elements of a game. There is a player, there are actions, there are payoffs, and the player has to formulate a strategy, which we have already figured out, right? So each subgame is a game. It has players, actions, payoffs, strategies. It has all the elements of a game. Perfect. Perfect is the requirement that player has to choose the optimal action for every possible scenario, not just the ones that is going to happen in the end. What does that mean? That means, in our case, when Mary chooses the action movie, David has to choose the action movie, even though this outcome never occurs in reality, because we understand that Mary is going to choose the romance movie. So this outcome is never happens. It never happens because Mary is going to choose a romance movie. So this state of the world never actually happens. Nevertheless, we require David to have an optimal plan. This is an assumption because there is nothing that stops David from imagining a plan that is suboptimal. It's never going to happen anyway, so why can't he imagine something weird, right? Like for example, like, you know, there are people who like say if if like this soccer team wins, I'm going to run naked in CUHK, that kind of thing. Well, you can make that kind of promise because you don't think that team is going to win, right? If you think that team has any chance of winning, you will not make such promise. That's what subgame perfect equilibrium does not allow. You're not allowed to make plans that is not optimal when that state of the world actually realized. David is not allowed to imagine himself going to the romance movie alone, because that's not in his interest if that ever happens, even though it never actually happens. So this something that never happens in equilibrium, we call that off equilibrium path. We call it off equilibrium path. One thing that another example of this requirement is a child cannot threaten to jump off the building when his parents force him to do homework, unless he really intends to do that. Obviously, if he really intends to do that, that's okay. But he can't threaten to jump off a building when he does not really meant to do it. Okay, so it's like the idea is, right, the child, don't force me to do homework. If you force me to do homework, I'm going to jump off the building, and then so the parents just give up, right? That's the idea. That's not allowed. You cannot make threats that you do not intend to carry out. The thing is, people do make threats like that in reality. So the subgame perfect equilibrium is actually excluding a lot of behavior that might actually happen in the real world. People making empty threats. People do that all the time. But that's not allowed here. You have to make plans that is credible. So this is suboptimal, not allowed. Right? It's not allowed. You can't do that. You have to choose. The equilibrium concept requires people to make optimal choices for every situation. And this makes subgame perfect equilibrium less realistic than we want, because people do make empty threats. Right, so we're going to force people to make the optimal choice for everything. And if you do that, then David's strategy depends on Mary's strategy, right? So David's strategy depends on what Mary does. If Mary chooses action, David chooses action. If Mary chooses romance, David chooses romance. And Mary's strategy is very simple: always choose romance. So no empty threats, and start solving the game from the bottom. In this particular case, it's quite clear that Mary is better off than David, because Mary gets to choose her favorite romance movie. Yeah, but whenever I use this example, I start thinking, well, am I gender stereotyping? Girls like romance movie. There's a student in the department, a girl who just told me she went to watch she went to watch Logan all by herself. So maybe there's some girls who like action movies too. So I don't know. Next time maybe I have to choose something else. Maybe choose some gender neutral names or something. Mary who chooses, so now in this situation, Mary who chooses first pick what she likes. David follows by picking the same thing. In the extensive form game, only romance is the equilibrium. Action is not. So the number of equilibrium is that of equilibria is actually different from the normal form. When they make decision at the same time, they could end up deciding to go to the action movie, or they could end up deciding to go to the romance movie. Not when Mary chooses first. Ladies first means ladies get her wish. So there's only one equilibrium. So in some sense, Mary is choosing the equilibrium that's better for her. So we call that first mover advantage. When there are more than one equilibria, the player who moves first can pick the one that gives her the highest payoff. So there's some advantage in moving first if there are stable outcomes. If there are stable outcomes, it's worthwhile to move first. But we'll see in the next example later on. You see that if there are no stable equilibrium, then it's actually worse to move first. And before we get there, just imagine what happened when you play rock, paper, and scissors and you move second, right? It's always better to move second when you play rock, paper, and scissors. You always win 100% of the time. So there are situations where it's actually better to move second when there is no equilibrium. So we see that in a moment. So is subgame perfect equilibrium realistic? As we already mentioned, it makes some assumptions that are contestable, at least. First, this idea that the players are smart. In subgame perfect in game theory, the assumption is people are very smart, hyper smart. So how smart? So smart that you can perfectly predict what your opponents. You can correctly predict your opponent's strategy. Now, in some cases, there are cases where there will be risk involved. So you don't necessarily can accurately predict which action the player can take, but you do get their strategy correct. So I understand what you try to do, and you understand what I try to do. In the theoretical context, that means that players are capable of doing backward induction for very long games. Now we have very simple games, that Mary chooses, then David chooses, N. But think about a chess game, right? Chess game have many rounds. I move, you move, I move, you move, I move, you move. Game theory assumes that people can do backward induction till the very end. So when I decide which piece to move, I can predict correctly your strategy. I can predict correctly your next move, and you, in turn, can correctly predict my third move, and I can predict your fourth move, right at the very beginning. So I know what you're going to do, and you know what I'm going to do. I know that you know that I know what I'm going to do, and you know I know what I'm going to do. So you see that it's somewhat ridiculous because it's not easy for actual human to do this kind of mental exercise beyond a few rounds. Certainly, that's not what actual chess player does. Playing chess would involve you would make predictions for a few rounds, but you certainly don't make predictions for 30 rounds probably. Instead, even the best players rely on heuristics, your feeling, right, your intuition. And not only that, for some games, even computers have to rely on heuristics. So what can the current generation of computers do? For simple games like tic for tac, computers can completely map out the outcomes. So things like 黑白棋、五子棋, that kind of stuff, like 5 in a row. These kind of games, computers can map it up completely. So that means there is no way a human can ever win a computer in games like that. They're just too simple. Computers always win. At most, you can expect a draw. For tic for tac is, you can always guarantee a draw, right? For tic for tac is simple enough. For chess game, I think we start to have enough. We have enough computing power to map up all possibilities of a chess game. We can do that. I think we can do that now. It takes a lot of processing power and it takes a lot of memory, but it's doable. For Go, it's impossible. Too many options to do that for Go. So that is why AlphaGo relies on heuristics. It relies on heuristics. It doesn't actually map out all possible moves on a Go board, on a chessboard. It's just impossible to do that, even with current computers. You have to use heuristics. Even so, the breakthrough of AlphaGo is not its computing power in trying to map out everything. The breakthrough of AlphaGo, it's how you teach computer heuristics. How do you teach computer intuition? And this is one of the major breakthroughs in recent years in artificial intelligence, is that computers are getting really good at intuition. Computers can draw, computers can make music, computers can write papers. So that's why it's going to be so. That's why people say it's going to be such a disruptive technology, because intuition is something that we used to think only human can do. So when not even computers can do that, why do we assume people can do that? That's one assumption that is not realistic. Second, complete plan. Players are required to have a plan for every possible scenario. Now let me ask you, what's your plan if there's an earthquake in Hong Kong in the next 5 minutes? What's the plan? No plan, right? Is the chance of Hong Kong having an earthquake in the next 5 minutes 0? No, the chance is very small. The last time Hong Kong had an earthquake is something in the 1800s. But Hong Kong did have earthquake before, and we could have earthquake again. It's just the chance is so small that no one ever has a plan for that. Then you're already violating complete plan, because game theory says you should have a plan for everything. Now, obviously, this cannot be true, because we don't have the time to make a plan for things that almost never happen. Finally, as we already mentioned, subgame perfect equilibrium requires the availability of an optimal plan. Now, people very often do not do that. They make empty threats. They don't think through what happens in cases where they don't think it's going to happen, right? So these assumptions make the situation less realistic than you might imagine. And so now I think I want to before we go on to do the exercise, let me first show you a video. So now this is the example that the exercise I want you to think through. So the idea is, so you have small potato. You have small potato it is a company that is considering entering the market currently dominated by Superman Lee. Superman Lee has to consider whether to fight back if small potato does enter, but fighting is costly. Find the Nash equilibrium in the normal form game. So do that, and find the subgame perfect equilibrium in the extensive form game. So so you have 2 tasks to do. Find the normal form game, which you do with the method that we have talked about. And so So that means you have to consider, what would small potato do when Superman Lee decides to accommodate? What would small potato do if Superman Lee decides to fight? what would Superman Lee do if Small Potato decides to stay out, and what would Superman Lee do if Small Potato decides to enter? Right? So that's a normal form game. Do that. And then you have to consider, well, what would Superman Lee do if Small Potato decides to enter? And actually, in this case, staying out would not be consequential, so nothing to do in that case. Right? Try doing that and see the difference and see the difference between the extensive form and the normal form. Okay, so let's start with the normal form game. If Superman Lee has decided to accommodate, Small Potato is facing the choice between staying out and earn no money, followed by at first is coming in and earn 2. So coming in is actually better if Superman Lee is accommodating, but if Superman Lee fights, staying out earns 0, coming in earns 3, so it's actually better to stay out, right? So whether Small Potato wants to enter depends on Superman Lee's choice. If Small Potato decides to stay out, it actually doesn't matter what Superman Lee does. There is no fight. But if Small Potato comes in, it's costly to actually fight. So Superman Lee would rather accommodate. In this case, there are two Nash equilibria. The one where Superman Lee accommodates and Small Potato comes in, and the other case is Superman Lee decides to fight and Small Potato stays out. In any case, there is actually no fighting. Right? There's no fighting. I come in, you stay out, and if you decide to fight, then I simply don't come in. In the extensive form game, Superman, I'm assuming that Small Potato gets to move first. If that's the case, Small Potato stays out, then he's done. There's nothing else for him to do. He just earns 0. If Small Potato comes in, Superman Lee has to choose between accommodating and fighting. Now once again I'm using the numbers from above, so the order doesn't represent their order of decision. In the exam, I will make it clear what's the number representing. So in this case, I'm just following the numbers above. So the second number represents Superman Lee in this case. So if he accommodate, he earns 1. If he fight, he earns -1. So it's yeah. So did I think? Right. Yeah. Okay. That's right. Yeah. 1 versus -1. So Superman is going to accommodate. If Superman accommodates, small potato obviously would be better off coming in than staying out. So he's going to choose in. In the end, you have two pure strategy Nash equilibria in the normal form game. Namely, out, fight, and in, accommodate. But in the subgame perfect equilibrium, Superman Lee action depends on what small potato does. If small potato decides to come in, then Superman Lee is certainly going to accommodate. But if small potato decides to stay out, then it could be anything. So we don't know what it is. In the case of small potato, well, he's just going to choose in. Once again, you have first mover advantage here because there are two possible pure strategy Nash equilibria. The one who moves first gets to choose which one. If you reverse the game and have Superman Lee move first, you realize that the subgame perfect equilibrium would become Superman Lee choosing fight and small potato staying out. Right, so this is it. You will see more of these in the assignment on game theory. Finally, there's one more to think about before we go. Think about this game, matching pennies. If you look at this game, the idea of this game is you have two players. And the game requires player 1 to match player 2's coin and player 2 to mismatch player 1's coin. So we both put forward a coin. I win if my coin has the same side as your coin. You win if your coin has a different side as my coin. Do you have a pure strategy Nash equilibrium in this case? Now if you look at it, if you think about it, your intuition should tell you there shouldn't be a pure strategy Nash equilibrium. I win by matching your coin. You win by mismatching your coin. Our incentive is exactly opposite, right? I put forward heads, you want tail. You put forward tails, I want tails. I put forward tails, you want heads. You put forward heads, I put forward heads. Our incentive, the game intentionally set up in a way that the incentives are opposite. The incentives are opposite. So you shouldn't expect a pure strategy Nash equilibrium, and indeed there is none. Suppose player 2 chooses heads. Player 1 wants to match his coin. So player 1 is choosing between putting forward the same side or different side, and the same side earns more. If player 2 chooses tail, once again, player 1 wins by matching the same side, so he wants to use tails. Player 2, if he wants to mismatch player 1's coin, if player 1 put forward a head, player 2 wins by putting forward a tail. And finally, if player 1 put forward a head, player 2 wins by putting forward a head. So there is no pure strategy Nash equilibrium because the incentives are set up in a way that they have completely opposite preference. Any dominant strategy, as you can see, players might use any action depending on the opponent's choice, so none and none. All right, this sounds like a mess. No equilibrium, no dominant strategy, no dominated strategy. What would happen in this case? Well, what would happen? In a situation where you can't pick a single action, what do people do? You have done that before. Everyone has done that. Namely, you have done that when you play rock, paper, and scissors. This is a simplified version of rock, paper, scissors, right? In rock, paper, scissors, you have 3 actions that each win against one and lose against the other. This is just a simplified version of that. In rock, paper, and scissors, do you ever use a single action? No, right? I hope you don't, because you always lose. If I always use rock, what do? Paper, right? You always win. So no one ever used a single action continuously in rock, paper, and scissors. Instead, what you do, you try to randomize among the different actions you can use, right? Rock, paper, and scissors. That's what happens. So in the case where the pure strategy Nash equilibrium does not exist, player randomize. Use each action with some chance. Use every action with some chance. That's called a mixed strategy Nash equilibrium. So instead of picking a single action, each player chooses a probability to randomize among different actions. Given the probabilities the other players have chosen, each player has no incentive to change her probability. So we have modified the stability concept. In the pure strategy Nash equilibrium, the stability concept is you choose a single action, I choose a single action. None of us wants to change our action. In mixed strategy Nash equilibrium, we have changed the stability concept to that of probability distribution. You choose the probability distribution of what you're going to do. I choose the probability distribution of what I am going to do. Given your probability, I don't want to change. Given my probability, you don't want to change. It's stable because we don't change the distribution of what we're going to do. Conceptually, it sounds a bit different, but mathematically, it's not too different, right? You're still choosing something that's stable. So it turns out that while pure strategy Nash equilibrium very often do not exist, a mixed strategy Nash equilibrium always exists. That is, there are always probabilities that people would be willing to stick with and not changing. There will be a set of probabilities that people are willing to stick with and not change. So mathematically, you can prove that is actually true. Which is why rock, paper, and scissors you can play rock, paper, and scissors. Because in rock, paper, and scissors, there is a certain ratio in which when you use, you don't want to change. And let's think about that. You can actually think about that. We want to do that now. Actually, let's do it next time because so what we're going to do next time is we're going to think about what ratio do you need to use in rock, paper, and scissors, because it's actually not as simple as you think. Even though it's very intuitive that you're doing the right thing, it's actually not easy to figure out why that is the case. All right, so we're going to do this next time.